Hello everyone, I'm KK. Welcome to Giraffe Tech. Let's see what's interesting today. Today we are looking at CXMT, China's most important DRAM company. The short version is this. CXMT is not about to beat SK hynix, Samsung, or Micron in high-end HBM tomorrow. That headline is too simple, but the bigger story is more interesting. CXMT matters because AI is changing the memory cycle. General DRAM is becoming important again. Chinese cloud customers are starting to validate domestic memory supply, and the equipment ecosystem behind CXMT may become just as important as CXMT itself. So this is not a China versus America video. This is not a nationalist technology story. This is an investment story. The question is simple. Where is the money moving in the memory supply chain? And which parts of the stack could get repriced? Let's walk through the evidence. First, we need to be clear about what CXMT is and what it is not. CXMT, or Changxin Memory Technologies, is China's largest DRAM company. It started in 2016, backed by China's semiconductor industrial policy, and built its business around 12-inch DRAM fabs. It began with older DDR4 and LPDDR4 products. Since then, it has moved into newer generations of memory, including DDR5 and LPDDR5X. By capacity, CXMT is now often discussed as the fourth meaningful DRAM player globally, behind Samsung, SK hynix, and Micron. That does not mean it is technically equal to them. It is not. On the most advanced nodes, on global customer qualification, and especially on HBM, the gap is still large. But CXMT has crossed an important line. It is no longer just a company people talk about as a future possibility. It is shipping real products into real devices. That difference matters. The original CXMT piece makes a useful point. The company is still behind, but it is becoming real. Its DDR5 has reportedly entered Lenovo laptops. Its LPDDR5X has gained meaningful share in China's smartphone market, and the company is pushing higher speed LPDDR5X products with 8,533 megabits per second, 9,600 megabits per second, and 10,667 megabits per second products in customer sampling. This is not the same as dominating global high-end memory, but it is enough to change the conversation. For a long time, the market treated CXMT as a domestic substitution story. In other words, a company that could sell inside China because China wanted a local supplier. That is still part of the story. But now the question is shifting. Can CXMT become credible enough that major customers, not just policy-driven buyers, start to consider it? That is where the Apple and Tencent signals become important. Citi recently pointed out that Apple was reportedly seeking approval to buy memory from CXMT. Whether that approval actually happens is not the only thing that matters. The fact that Apple is even considering CXMT tells the market something. Apple is not a casual customer. Apple does not put unreliable memory into high-volume devices just to make a political statement. So even if the deal does not go through, the signal is still valuable. CXMT's product reliability is good enough to be evaluated by one of the most demanding electronics companies in the world. Citi's framing is direct. Apple's consideration helps shift CXMT from a domestic substitution story toward a credible global number 4 DRAM maker. That is a big statement. Then there is Tencent. Reuters reported that CXMT signed a long-term server DRAM supply agreement with Tencent worth more than 20 billion yuan, or roughly $3 billion. This matters because server DRAM is a different level of validation from consumer devices. Smartphones and laptops matter, but cloud customers care about reliability, supply stability, cost, power, and long-term availability at scale. If Tencent is willing to lock in a long-term supply agreement, that tells us domestic DRAM is moving from a policy theme into actual cloud infrastructure procurement. Again, the point is not that CXMT has already won the global DRAM market. The point is that customer validation is starting to accumulate. Lenovo, Chinese smartphone makers, Apple consideration, and Tencent server DRAM are 4 different signals. Together, they say the same thing. CXMT is becoming more real. Now, here is the important counterweight. HBM is still the hard ceiling. HBM, or high bandwidth memory, is not just normal DRAM stacked higher. It is one of the most difficult products in the semiconductor industry. You need advanced DRAM dies. You need TSVs, microbumps, thermal control, extremely high-yield stacking, advanced packaging, and deep co-validation with AI accelerator companies. This is why SK hynix has been so important to NVIDIA. It is also why Samsung and Micron are spending heavily to catch up in the highest-end HBM market. CXMT is not close to that leadership position today, and this distinction is important for investors. If someone says CXMT is about to replace SK hynix in NVIDIA's supply chain, that is hype. But if someone says CXMT can become a serious supplier in general DRAM and maybe support parts of China's domestic AI supply chain, that is a different claim. That second claim is much more plausible. The JP Morgan memory note gives a useful reminder of how demanding the HBM roadmap has become. NVIDIA's next-generation platforms increasingly depend on HBM4 supply. JP Morgan noted that Rubin shipments could be limited by HBM4 availability. Samsung and SK hynix are already talking about the next-generation HBM designs, thermal solutions, and even HBM5-based die technology. Samsung's roadmap discussion included very high bandwidth targets and advanced base dies. SK hynix is also pushing integrated cooling concepts for future HBM. This is a world where the leaders are not standing still. So CXMT's HBM gap is real. But that gap does not kill the investment story. It just tells us where the story is. The story is not CXMT beats HBM leaders. The story is AI is changing memory economics, and CXMT may enter the parts of the market where the incumbents are creating space. Now, let's talk about the memory cycle. Traditional memory was brutally cyclical. When prices were high, companies expanded capacity. When too much capacity came online, prices crashed. Then companies cut supply, demand recovered, and the cycle started again. That old cycle still exists, but AI is changing the structure of demand. HBM is the most obvious example. In AI inference, memory bandwidth and memory capacity can directly affect token throughput. If more HBM allows a GPU system to produce more useful tokens per unit of time, then customers can justify paying more for HBM. That is different from older DRAM cycles, where memory was often just a cost component. In AI, memory can be a revenue enabler, but the story does not stop at HBM. DRAM gets a second growth curve from agent workloads, CPU memory residency, and a larger context handling. More agents, more parallel tasks, more memory resident data, and more local inference all push up DRAM demand. NAND also gets pulled into the AI stack through KV cache offloading, AI video sandboxed agent workflows, and cold or warm data storage. So HBM, DRAM, and NAND are no longer 3 completely separate stories. They are becoming layers in the same AI memory hierarchy. HBM is the hot layer. DRAM is the warm layer. NAND is the colder, cheaper, larger layer. That is why this CXMT video cannot only be about CXMT. If the whole memory complex is being repriced, then a new DRAM supplier matters more than it would have mattered in a normal down cycle. This is where the external research becomes useful. Obey, or Bank of America, looked at Micron's recent results and argued that the memory supercycle, or at least the current shortage environment, could continue into 2027 or even beyond. Goldman Sachs also pointed to positive DDR5 pricing trends and became more constructive on 2027 HBM pricing. In Goldman's framework, conventional DRAM pricing also matters when people discuss HBM pricing. That is important. It means the market is no longer pricing HBM in isolation. The entire DRAM complex can tighten together. That creates the setup for CXMT. If general DRAM were collapsing, a new Chinese DRAM supplier would probably be seen as another source of oversupply. But in a stronger memory cycle, with AI pushing demand higher, CXMT's capacity may be viewed differently. It can still create price pressure in some segments, but it can also become part of a larger supply response to structural demand. Now let's bring in the wildcard, 3D DRAM. This is more speculative, but it is important. Planar DRAM scaling is getting harder. The incumbents have enormous advantages in EUV process control, materials, and customer qualification. If the industry stays on a path where success depends mostly on shrinking planar DRAM with the most advanced lithography, China remains at a disadvantage, but 3D DRAM could change part of the competitive map. The analogy is not perfect, but think about what happened in NAND. When NAND moved from planar to 3D structures, the nature of competition changed. It was no longer only about making the smallest planar cell. It became about stacking, etching, deposition, materials control, layer uniformity, and integration. If DRAM moves in a similar direction, the bottlenecks could shift. EUV would still matter. The incumbents would still have advantages. But more of the battle could move into high aspect ratio etch, deposition, cleaning, metrology, materials, and equipment integration. That is where China's equipment ecosystem becomes relevant. China is constrained in advanced lithography, but Chinese companies have been investing heavily in etch deposition, cleaning, CMP, materials, wet chemicals, and other parts of the semiconductor equipment stack. This is why the Goldman China CAP report fits into the CXMT story. Goldman is not just looking at one memory company. It is looking at memory expansion, advanced logic expansion, and the equipment companies that benefit from a longer investment cycle. The report highlights names like NARA, AMIC, ACM Research, and NG Micro. NARA is important in deposition and HHH. AMAC is important in etch. ACM Research is known for cleaning and other process tools. NG Micro is tied to CMP slurry and wet electronic chemicals. The key point is not that every one of these stocks is automatically a buy. This is not financial advice. The point is that the profit pool may move beyond CXMT itself. If memory and advanced logic expansion continue, and if localization remains important, the equipment and materials layer could capture a lot of value. For investors, that matters. Sometimes the best way to invest in a semiconductor theme is not a headline company. It is the tools, materials, and bottleneck suppliers behind the headline company. This is especially true when a headline company is private, pre-IPO, or difficult to access directly. CXMT may be the story people talk about, but the investable story could be the equipment ecosystem around it. That is why I think the right framing is balanced. We do not need to say CXMT is about to beat SK hynix. We also do not need to dismiss CXMT because it is behind in HBM. Both extremes miss the investment question. The real question is, what changes if CXMT becomes credible in general DRAM during an AI-driven memory upcycle? First, it gives China a stronger domestic supply option for smartphones, PCs, servers, and some AI infrastructure. Second, it pressures parts of the general DRAM market, especially if the incumbents focus more capacity and capital on HBM. Third, it creates demand visibility for Chinese equipment and materials companies. Fourth, it creates a possible 3D DRAM option, where the next architecture shift could matter more than the current node gap. And fifth, it gives investors a new way to think about the memory cycle. This is not just a supply threat. It is also a signal that memory is becoming strategic infrastructure. So here is the final takeaway. If your question is, will CXMT replace SK hynix in NVIDIA's HBM supply chain next year? The answer is no. That is not the serious investment case. If your question is, can CXMT become a credible general DRAM supplier, win important domestic customers, reduce China's dependence on foreign memory, and pull the local equipment ecosystem forward? The answer is yes, That is increasingly plausible. And if AI keeps pushing memory demand higher, that plausible story becomes more investable. For me, the cleanest way to think about CXMT is this. It is not a finished memory giant. It is not just a policy project. And it is not a near-term HBM leader. It is a system-level variable. That is the real story. And for investors, system-level variables are worth watching before they become obvious. That's it for today. If this was useful, follow Giraffe Tech. I'm KK. More thoughts on X and Substack. See you next time.